Hello and welcome to my video of the March Soap Challenge Club submission. This video shows the part of what was supposed to be just the prop in the background of my actual submission. I initially thought about just submitting a poster, and then I thought, actually, why not give this a try and try piping with cold process soap. And so in this video, I'm going to show you how I did this. I did speed up parts of this quite fast because otherwise you would have been sat through this for quite a long time. So let's get started. What you can see here at the moment is, of course, the final prop that I did use as a backdrop for my soap submission. I will show you now in detail how I went about making this. But just to give you a little overview, the background is soap dough that I flattened out. The swirly pattern comes from the same batch from the soap dough, whilst the letters are from a completely different recipe. So before I could get started with any of my letters, with any of my piping, I needed my mix, of course. As you can see here on the left, there's some very colourful pots. These were all the different soap dough parts for my main entry. So for the treasure box, for the biscuits, but also for my bonus entries, those little oysters that I made. And so I had all of those sorted, and then I needed just that little part for those letters. And I initially thought about just keeping it that neutral colour, that kind of slightly creamy colour. But actually I wasn't quite happy with how that would look because I wanted it quite similar to what it was on the poster. I want a bit more of a golden colour. So actually what I did, I added some iron oxide, some yellow here, and mixed it in. This was not quite enough yet. As you can see, I'm just adding some more. And of course, for the piping, I needed a consistency that wasn't too runny, but at the same time, not too hard either. So here I was kind of every now and then mixing a little bit and just checking, is that about right to be able to do the piping properly without running the risk of the letters just literally washing away or else not coming out of my piping bag. There we are. I'm just giving another quick stir. You can see the colour is quite nice. It is still, for my liking, a little bit too runny, so I just left it on the side for a little while longer just for it to thicken up a bit more before I was ready to use it. So with my colour nicely mixed in, it was time to get piping. This is one of my standard piping bags. I just cut off the very tip of this bag, as you can see here, just so it's got a really fine, thin pencil line. I usually use these bags for my whipped soaps, but I normally have much wider tips that I use and have special inserts, which I didn't have for this thin one. I also used parchment paper here, and underneath it put my poster just to make sure that I could have exactly the right font and the right lettering as it was on the poster. Just giving this another little stir here, and I'm thinking actually this consistency is probably quite good for me to get started with the piping. I could have probably stopped at this point here. I think I definitely had enough in hindsight. But you know, it'd always be better to have a little bit more in there rather than having to add some more and create a bit of a bigger mess. So I'm just filling this in, giving it a little push down, trying to get air bubbles out because it's nothing more annoying than actually piping and suddenly you've got a big blob of air coming through and ruining whatever you've just done. But that's looking a really good consistency. It's not too runny, it's not too hard. I can easily squeeze it out. At this point, I was really quite happy with how the batter came out of the piping bag. You can see it created nice lines, it kept its shape, it felt easy to push out of the piping bag, so it was not too solid, it was not too runny, it was literally just right. So I was really quite happy with that. This slightly changed the following day when I looked at my letters as they were drying, as they seemed to have shrank a little bit. So that drying process made them go a little bit wrinkly and uneven, and sadly it didn't feel right, it didn't look right anymore, it didn't look very professional. So I did the whole process again, and I will show you in a second a close-up of this one and then of the second attempt. With the second attempt, what I kept doing, almost like watering flowers, I literally kept spraying the letters throughout the day and the night with some rubbing alcohol. I wasn't sure whether that was going to do the trick, but actually they kept their shape nicely whilst still drying and getting hard. Because one of my biggest concerns was getting these letters off the parchment paper and onto my sheet of rolled out soap dough. What you probably notice here as well is that some of these letters are a bit thick. That is obviously the piping bag tip, and I tried with the second one to have it even thinner, but that was quite hard to do. Obviously a professional proper metal piping tip here would have been quite nice, but I didn't have that, and actually I think in the end this worked quite nicely. Having completed this set once, I decided to just go over some of these letters. You can see the I on the top sheet here doesn't look as neat, neither does the C, so I just decided to give these another go, and they did come out a little bit neater here. Obviously, these letters were the ones that in the end I didn't use because they did shrink, sadly, too much. So of course I'm not going to show you the entire second take on doing these letters here again, but just to give you a little bit of an insight, this now is the second attempt I did. It was a completely different recipe. It was the one from my main soap rather than the soap dough recipe. And it was a very different consistency. You cannot see that here, but it was a much harder to squeeze out. The letters broke much easier, so that was harder. But at the same time, I felt that the letters actually held their shape better. They came out neater, they came out thinner. That could have obviously also been a slightly different piping bag top. But overall, this take just worked a lot better for me. Like I said, much harder work, but it looked a lot neater, as you can hopefully see here as well. So as with my first set of letters, these ones as well, I left to dry for a good couple of days, and I did spray rubbing alcohol on them every now and then in an attempt to really avoid them curling up as they were drying and ultimately shrinking a little bit. I'd spent so much time making such neat lines, or as neat as possible, and I really wanted them to look the same neat and straight on the final backdrop. In the meantime, I did prep my actual base. That's the turquoise here. You could just see I tried to create it as close to the original color of that poster. Tried to get that turquoise as similar as possible. I did use some cling film just to avoid the soap dough sticking to my rolling pin. I started with a small one, and then just to get a really nice, smooth overall consistency, I used the big rolling pin and then just cut it into the right shape. And then finally, the moment of truth. It was finally time after all those days to try and put this all together. What I had done, I'd used the poster and I used a little toothpick to make some markers on my turquoise base just to know where exactly each one of these letters needed to go. And I was surprised by how well the letters actually came off the parchment paper. A couple of them did break, but as you can see, I had made some spare letters, just the ones that I wasn't 100% happy with initially. Now, because they had dried, they didn't completely stick by themselves because both the base and the letters were a little bit too dry. So what I did before I put the letters on, I put a little bit of water just on the turquoise soap dough base, and then they stuck really easily, really quickly. And this was actually a really enjoyable, although quite fiddly process. I was a little bit concerned whether you would see my water added on to that base, but it dried quite nicely actually in the end. And on the topic of drying, obviously with my first attempt, I had the problem of the shrinking, of the curling up of the letters, that they didn't look smooth and straight. Now, as you can see here, these ones are in fact really smooth, really straight. They look just as they did when they were wet and fresh. Now, I did spray these with rubbing alcohol, and I'd like to think that this had an impact and it helped them stay in their original shape. However, I of course also used a different recipe, so maybe also the change of recipe had a little bit of an impact. Now, this twirly design I actually did use from the original batch, but I wasn't too keen on the color. For me, it wasn't golden enough, so I actually painted this with a little bit of golden mica, and I love the little sparkle it got at the end here. So there we have it, the final product. I'm really quite happy with this, and it was such a fun project to do. It was very time consuming, getting the batter ready, making sure there's enough time for drying in between the different stages, keeping an eye on those letters. I would definitely use rubbing alcohol again next time to just keep those letters in their shape. Like I said, I'm not 100% sure whether that's what did the trick in the end, but to me that seemed to really work. Using water to glue them down works as well. As you can see here, you can't actually see any leftover spots. You'd probably need to make sure not to use too much water, but otherwise it's a real fun project to do, so give it a go. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see the actual treasure box and biscuits, I am going to upload a separate video of that, as well as my bonus category, the cute little fun oysters, which are completely made from soap dough, so you will be able to find them in separate videos. You can also find me on Instagram on sokind_UK or on my website sokind.co.uk. Thank you very much and goodbye.